between idealism and pragmatism in international affairs and foreign and security policy choices, and in particular as it bears on this region. And we have several speakers to start us off. Each will speak briefly, and then we'll have hopefully a good discussion. And because I've had very little time to prepare here, I don't have all their bios immediately in front of me, but Mustafa Aydin is an international relations professor and specialist, theorist, and esteemed scholar. And he is also now the rector of Kadir Has University in Istanbul. Did I pronounce it correctly? Then next is Helen Koshtaria. I hope I didn't do too much damage to the correct pronunciation of your name, Helen. And she has established a nonpartisan, non-governmental policy watchdog and think tank called GRASS, Georgia's Reform Associates. And she's also an academic and studies Georgia's European and Euro-Atlantic integration and regional security and so on. She will speak second, and thank God that we finally have a woman on the panel here, although we intended to have one on the first one. Third, we'll hear from Richard Garagosian. Richard is the founding director of the Regional Studies Center, an independent think tank in Yerevan, Armenia. And finally, we'll hear from Vasil, also known as David, which is a little bit easier for me, maybe. Sikaru Lizde?
Brilliant.
No, I did terribly, but the fact that you said that reflects your long career as a Georgian diplomat and foreign affairs advisor to the president of Georgia for some period of time. So it's a varied panel with a wide range of regional and functional and intellectual experience. So let's go in the order of the speakers. And so, Mustafa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Larry. I was looking, well, let me start by thanking Nino and putting together all these people here. It's a great honor to speak here. I was looking to the title when trying to prepare some ideas what to say, and the title is confusing, of course. This is the only title of the panel of all this conference that has two brackets. You know, it says we have to look into idealism versus pragmatism, then bracket, values versus power, then another bracket called integrational vectors. So I don't know what to say about all this, but let me start by killing, if any of you have any idea of going towards idealism or values, let me start killing that. I think that in the Caucasus, even the idealism is limited or surrounded or defined by pragmatism and realism. It has to, in the post-Cold War era, at least. But if you're even inclined to read in the history, last 250 years, I think idealism was kind of a rare flower in this environment. It's very difficult to grow. Why? One thing is that in the Caucasus, of course, Russia is closer than God, and it's closer than any. Sorry, if I touch sensibilities of anybody's belief system, I'm sorry. Let me rephrase that. Russia is closer than any of the countries or the champions of the ideals that the regional countries wants to follow. Right? This has become very clear between two events: August 2008, Georgian War, and Crimea, annexation of Crimea. The result and the lessons, I think, the regional countries and the decision makers have drawn from these two events are strongly favors towards pragmatism. First of all, when I look at it, the first lesson a regional leader might draw from these two events is that power politics pays. You know, if you are powerful enough, and if you are willing to use the power, then you can get whatever you like to get. The failure of international community, including the West and the United States, of course, to resist and stop Russia in August 2008 led to annexation of Crimea of last year. And if you are a regional leader in Georgia, in Azerbaijan, in Armenia, what can you think? I mean, you know, idealism? Well, that's something else, maybe. The second lesson is that armaments and self-reliance on military power is important in this environment. This is the lesson I would get if I were a leader in this region, which is sad, of course, that, you know, this is something that we have been speaking against for years, at least last 10 years. And a third lesson is the strategic choice of West, which was clearly shown by Georgians, to less extent by Azerbaijanis, and even less extent by the Armenians. The strategic choice of West do not insulate you from the troubles that are nearby. Another lesson would be democratic governance might not be the best way forward. You know, this is something that we have been talking again, the experts in the region. We have been promoting democracy, good governance, rule of law, even here. But, you know, if you are a leader of a country here and trying to do all this, then losing 1/3 of your country to another state which is not following the rule of law, not democracy, and then what kind of a lesson you would get? You know? And finally, I think another lesson would be that Russia is too close, too powerful, too willing and vengeful, while the West is disoriented, disorganized, and unwilling. I think that's a very sad story from 2008 up until today. This is where we find ourselves today. And when I look at it, the geopolitical realities of today and the security problems in this region, leaving aside Russia for a moment, that's a huge bogey looming large in the north, but there are other problems, many problems that many people have already touched here, like energy dimension. Right? There is abundance of energy in the in the east of Georgia here. Azerbaijan has enough energy to feed the regional countries, to Turkey, and even to sell to Europe. But, you know, apart from Baku-Tiflis-Ceyhan, Baku-Tiflis-Erzurum, you know, the lines connected Azerbaijan through Georgia to Turkey, it has not been possible so far to vent out of the region with these resources. The main of Azerbaijan from the first day of independence was to connect Europe, to sell and to send all these energy resources to Europe. And we have not been able to do so yet. Why not? What happened to Nabucco project? Why it failed? What's happening now with so-called Turkish Stream? You know, it used to be South Stream, now it's called Turkish Stream. What's the difference? It's still the Russian gas. You know, it's supposed to come through Turkey instead of Bulgaria, but it's exactly the same source, almost the same road. Of course, Turkey will earn more money from it, but apart from that, there is no difference. So why it has all this failed? Why there is no European connection, direct connection to Azerbaijan and the resources of the Caspian? Because there is no European energy policy. Right? There are energy policies of Germany, France, Italy, and all the countries, but they contradict with what the European strategic view towards this region. Another issue, sustaining prosperity and increased standards of living in this neighborhood. This is, of course, very much connected to democratization, democratic governance, rule of law. But anybody and all the experts who would visit the region, when they know that when you go outside capitals, Yerevan, Tbilisi, or even Baku. The wealth accumulated over the last 20 years is not distributed evenly throughout these countries, or throughout the territory. So this even created more divisions within the countries themselves, let alone between the countries. And there is, of course, related problem here. Some of the wealth accumulated in the last 20 years are increasingly being spent towards militarization and armament, which is even more dangerous for this in the discussion of idealism versus pragmatism. Now, the main challenge is, of course, when Larry was speaking in the first time in the morning, he mentioned something, and I put it down. The main challenge in this region is how to ensure and maintain sovereign, secure, and stable states in the neighborhood. When you look at all these challenges and the problems, both internal, regional, and external problems, it's very difficult to respond to this question. It's a very tall order to secure, to have sovereign, secure, and stable states. One choice, because part of the question of this panel is the alternative choices in the region. One choice of the regional countries would be going along with Russia. This is a choice. And I think, for good or for bad, for different reasons, Armenia has chosen that path. Right? For various reasons. I'm not going into the reasons whether it's correct or not. But it creates problems if you go along with Russia. It creates problems of dependency, one-side dependency. It creates almost a vassal state. If I'm wrong, Richard, please correct me. It creates a vassal state. So it's not ideal solution. Another option is trying to integrate with the transatlantic organizations. This is what the previous panel was about. But there is a huge problem there also. Ambiguity in NATO. We don't know whether NATO wants to expand even more. Actually, we know as a fact that some of the countries, not NATO member countries, do not want to expand into the problematic territories. And we know that unwillingness of EU to expand anyway towards this. So if the EU and NATO is unwilling or not possible to expand themselves, how are you going to integrate these countries with these Western institutions? So that's problematic too. The third option is aligning yourself, your country, with the West in general. Actually, this is mainly with the US because Europe is not for alignment, without actually integrating the Western institutions. So that's a choice. That's a choice that Georgia tried during the Saakashvili's term. So see what it brought Georgia into. So that there is a problem there also because the powerful countries have the different and wider interests than the regional interest of regional countries, of course. So it's very difficult to combine the interest of a country like Georgia, a small country in the Caucasus, with a superpower like United States, because the United States would have much wider interests around the world. So I'm finishing now. Another option is something that Azerbaijanis keep talking. It's what they call balanced relationship or balanced foreign policy. It is another illusion, of course. What they meaning balance is balance between East and between West and Russia. This, of course, eventually forces you to choose side, especially if Russians decide to come down from north to south. So that's, again, not insulation. Finally, there is something almost default emerges. That's a triangle between Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. And I wish it was not a triangle. I wish it would have been much better if it was a square, including Armenia. But it's a triangle so far. It is some sort of a midway towards integration with the West. It's not West, it's not integration, it's somewhere in the middle. It's less threatening to Russia than the integration into NATO or European Union. It is economically rewarding for the three countries, allows some sort of a development of political ideas, provides a kind of a stability and connection to the West for the regional countries. But it has weaknesses also. It demands and it needs constant attention and strong Turkish commitment, I think, which is not there, unfortunately, at the moment. So that's the weakness of this choice also. For Turkey, of course, I have to say a few words and finish there. Turkey's position has weakened in the Caucasus, I believe, alongside the Western position and the US and the European position in the Caucasus since 2008. It's not only weakened because of the Russian ever strong presence in the region, but also because Turkish distraction and looking into the south rather than north. And of course, historical luggage on Turkey's shoulders about Turkish-Armenian relations is, again, another weakening problem. And as long as the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict continues, that luggage and baggage would have to be there, unfortunately. I think let me stop there.
Okay, thank you so much. I suppose I should have stopped you maybe in terms of time, but the problem is what you said was so incredibly fascinating and so beautifully framing of this session. All I could do is try and take notes and be your student. So thank you for that. Helen, you're next.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your quite, I would say, bold and provocative speech, putting out all the challenges and concerns of the region, which I fully share in the part of listing the security challenges, though I wouldn't agree in the contradiction of idealism and pragmatism, and I will try to make that point on exactly on the case of Georgia. And secondly, I wouldn't agree that it's an accomplished picture of where the world stands now. I think the responses to some of those challenges are in the making. And I think the history of the last 70 years, 60 years after World War II proves the opposite. Now, today's discussion somehow divided the topic of democracy and security in two different baskets. And before I describe the Georgia's foreign policy choices, I would like to set the context that actually, and especially in this region, democracy and security go hand in hand. I think there is no long-term sustainable democracy without security guarantees, without addressing those security challenges that exist. And there is, I believe, no long-term security without democracy. And I think the example of Europe proves this point exactly. The combination of NATO and EU and their parallel enlargement, the combination of prosperity and democracy that was created by EU together with the NATO as a security guarantee, brought peace, transformation, modernization, and security to Europe for over than 60 years. In that sense, describing Georgia's foreign policy, I think it's important to know that for us, foreign policy is a part of the state building. It's part of promoting, developing democracy, and part of finding solutions to security challenges. The choice that Georgia has made has is both value-driven and pragmatic. Back in even late 80s and early 90s, when Georgia was fighting for independence, part of this fight and part of those ideals that Georgia was fighting for was the European values and European lifestyle and European family of nations. So for us, independence meant not only dissolution of the Soviet Union, but going into NATO, into EU, no matter how hard it turned out to really implement. And in early 90s, it turned out that it was rather a dream than a plan. And it seems that Georgian dreams don't come true so easily. But actually, since then, it has been a very consistent and firm foreign policy choice of Georgian public. Never ever public support for NATO and EU has gone less than 60%. in very difficult circumstances, in the disappointing time of 90s, where the state was nearly failing, nor during the war, where the expectation of international support was maybe higher, and nor during the change of governments in this country. This public support is very consistent and firm. Now, of course, it's on the one hand, it's a value-based and idealistic strive to go back to family of nations, but at the same time, it's very pragmatic. Quite soon after the gaining independence, we realized that we actually have not gotten our independence fully. We do not control our territory fully. We don't have foreign policy choices, and Russia has an ambition to at least have part of our sovereignty and independence in their hands. We tried the balancing. We tried nearly all the options that you have listed in your introduction. Going to CIS and siding with Russia, balancing between West and Russia, compromising, not irritating Russia, pleasing Russia, trying to find some engagement with and some attraction of Western interests, but not to irritate Russia. And eventually we ended up with the same security problems, with lack of development, with lack of democracy. So I think the foreign policy choice of Georgia is very clear and has idealistic and very pragmatic goal of ensuring democracy and security. Now, of course, the picture is not so rosy. And there are several internal and external challenges to implementation of this foreign policy choice. The internal, I would say, and I hope there are some government representatives that could debate or argue my point, but despite the fact that I do not share some conspiracy theories that there is a Russian guy ruling this country and the change of power has dramatically changed the foreign policy course, I think there is enough evidence that the overall framework of Georgian foreign policy with the new government is unchanged. But there are two fundamental problems with the foreign policy vision of this government that may undermine the success on that track. The first is linking our Western integration to Russia and somehow making the linkage of going west to the extent it doesn't irritate Russia. And at its very beginning, even theoretically, it's not possible to be successful on the Russian path, on the Western path, if you are just looking how irritated Russia is, because it says that it's irritated about the very existence of association agreement, EU, democracy, NATO, or anything that we're striving for. So it cannot be the criteria for our Western integration. We see the voices of already public officials saying and somehow appeasing and pleasing and pacifying Russia that don't worry, they are not, NATO enlargement is not today's or tomorrow's issue. We are not going to have NATO bases here. Well, we are going to NATO, it's unchanged, but we will do it in a way not to irritate you. It's a dead game. It cannot work like that. And the second problem of our internal problem of current foreign policy is that current Georgian government is not taking part in shaping the agenda of European Union or NATO towards the region. We are somehow in a position of taking whatever is given, but not really pushing for our own agenda. And considering what's the state of EU's policy towards the region, and considering all the challenges and differences in the position of EU and NATO member states, just waiting will not bring the results. And I think especially with the events in Ukraine, Georgia has a very strong case to push and to explain that it's rather better for European security to embrace Georgia rather than leave this black hole open for Russian speculations. On the external part of the challenges, I will not elaborate on Russian challenge. It's the reality that exists, that has always existed. I don't think that it has ever been a surprise for Georgia that Russia has never been an advocate for democracy. We had never illusions about Russia's either values or revisionist moves. But what is the bigger challenge is either ambiguity or lack of comprehensive and strategic vision of the West, and there I mean both the US and European states, how to address the security challenges in this part of Europe. And, or even worse, somehow going into to the point that maybe it's time to stop the enlargement, and maybe it's time not to mess up in this troubled region. And now I want to end with a very short conversation with the European diplomat, quite high-level diplomat, whom I was explaining that how Georgia is striving for democracy and values, and he said, stop talking about this. The politics is realpolitik, and actually it seems that you will have to, this conversation was like 3 or 4 years ago, not now. He said, well, it's realpolitik, and you will have to live in another Soviet Union for a while. And my answer was that, well, we may have to live in a Soviet Union, but the problem is that you don't understand that the Soviet Union poses the problem to you equally as to me. And I think that understanding, there is a pragmatic interest of embracing this region, is a biggest challenge to our foreign policy choice. Thank you.
Well, some of us are trying to make that point in the US, but I'll return to that. Richard, you're next.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be back in Georgia, but I must confess, as the token Armenian in this conference, sitting on this panel is especially challenging. If we're looking at choices in foreign policy and choices in security, Armenia has very little choice. And to be honest, it means I have very little to say, but a hell of a lot of work to do back in Armenia. So therefore, I do want to limit myself to focusing on 4 specific points, 2 of which are optimistic and 2 of which are realistic. First, in many ways, as we all know, Armenia suffered a strategic setback, a dramatic U-turn in policy, where the Armenian president, very much unilaterally, decided to give in and give up far too easily to Russia, and sacrificed a 3.5-year negotiated association agreement for a commitment to joining the then Customs Union, now the Eurasian Union. However, the European Union, for its own part, never gave in, never gave up on Armenia or the Armenians. We are now currently salvaging a relationship with the EU through a new draft legal framework. Although the damage has been done, we've lost a unique opportunity, we've lost an association agreement, and more importantly, a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. But it is an opportunity for the Armenian government to regain lost confidence and trust, and to try to at least demonstrate a degree of competence. My second point is a little more pessimistic. And to be honest to my friends in Georgia, it begins with a lesson from Georgia. The lesson in my mind is individual Democrats are great, welcome, needed. But individual Democrats are not as important as democratic institutions. In the Armenian case, the second lesson is that individual autocrats are nasty people, nasty men, and you'll notice it's always men in many cases. But my point is, an individual autocrat is also not the problem. It's the autocratic systems that are the problem, which means also that the solutions are systemic, not individual or personal. And in many ways, one mistake we may make is Russia. Putin and Putin's Russia is not the excuse for all of our problems, nor is it the reason for our own shortcomings in domestic policy or shortcomings and deficiencies in democracy. Moreover, the European Union is not the answer to all our problems either. It's an instrument, it's a tool. But it's much less about the interesting, sexy world of geopolitics. It's more about local economics and politics in many cases. And we shouldn't be lazy and complacent in blaming everything on Russia and disregarding our own culpability, our own responsibility, burden sharing, if you will. My third point is looking at the issue of values versus power. I would transform that into arguing for the power of values and ideals. We underestimate our own case far too often. We overestimate Russian soft power or its ability to transform the debate. But if we look at winning hearts and minds, which is actually much more crucial, what are Russian values anyway? Corruption? Authoritarianism? It's inherently a hard sell for Russian values compared to the Western ideals. In other words, more specifically, Russia's policy is very short-term. It stems from a position of weakness, not strength, insecurity, not confidence, and it's based on coercion and pressure, if not invasion and occupation. The Western model inherently is based on the power of seduction, of attraction, normative powers. We far too underestimate our own advantage in the battle for hearts and minds. But we need to do a much better job to define and defend European and Western values and ideals. And my fourth point is looking at a new trend. And again, it's optimism. The new trend in Armenia is very interesting since the new year. Armenia remains still firmly pro-Russian, but much less pro-Putin. And there's an important new divergence here, where many of us in the pro-Western camp in Armenia cannot hopefully or cannot realistically try to counter the Armenian-Russian relationship, given the security reality. What we do succeed in is attacking the terms of that Armenian-Russian relationship, the asymmetry, the lack of respect. Russia is very counterproductive in the way it mistreats its so-called ally Armenia, which means a divergence between a pro-Russian reliance no longer translating into pro-Putin vassal status gives us a lot more to work with. Moreover, in terms of a new trend, I'm also optimistic for one important opening. August 2008, as many of us have personally experienced, remade the map in a very negative way. There's one opening. It's Armenian-Turkish normalization that has the power and potential to remake the geopolitical map in a very positive way. It's no accident that Mustafa and I are both committed to working together and no longer being prisoners of the past, but building a common future based on a realistic reassessment. It's Armenian-Turkish normalization that in some ways Georgia doesn't pay enough attention to because of the direct impact it will have on Georgia. But finally, the real reason for my optimism, because I may be crazy, but I'm not foolish. I chose to live in this region. I chose to move here from Washington, D.C. And I'm not that foolish. I wouldn't live in the region if I did not have a degree of inherent optimism. The optimism in the Armenian context is also because we're in transition, demographically, generationally, and psychology, in terms of psychology. And in the Armenian context, we're smaller than Georgia, in territory and in demographics. I used to always think what a negative that was for Armenia, until I lived there. In other words, the small size of Armenia has a tremendous advantage. That advantage is rooted in the premise or the fact that it doesn't take much, it doesn't take many, and it doesn't take that long for real change. But it's not up to the EU, it's not an excuse of blaming everything on Putin. We get the governments we deserve the burden is on our own shoulders. It's symbolic that I'm not wearing a tie because I want to show that I'm not in the government. I'm from civil society. Sometimes civil society needs to be much less civil and much more assertive in fighting for basic human rights, tolerance, and pushing back and pushing out against dangerous trends coming often from Russia, but also from the church and other institutions. And finally, it's important to mention, in my opinion, in conclusion, that I have no conclusion. This is a dynamics, not a static process. There is no conclusion, either analytically or personally. This fight is just beginning, but we're beginning to win. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for those very clear and inspired remarks. And now, Vasil, you have the floor.
Thank you. I think it's, I guess it's my turn to comment on the title, because everyone did. So it reminds me that once I had the conversation with a very good friend from Germany, who is very skillful and prominent academician in security studies. And when I went on with my arguments why Georgia should become NATO member, he said that, you know, my friend, what's your problem? You probably spend too much time in the United States. We don't do long-term planning. All our strategy planning is about the next elections. And that's what we mainly focus on. Just to put it in the context of our title is that there is no such a choice between realists and idealists. It's more choice between short-termists and the long-termists. When we take a look on the foreign policy choices, they of course are determined by the dominant ideas of the statecraft of respective countries in South Caucasus. It does not mean that all these countries are implementing their domestic statecraft in the right way, or they are going in the right way to achieve the objectives determined by their statecraft, or how they see the priorities. But Georgia has chosen to build liberal democracy. We've chosen to have an open economy. Therefore, I mean, a natural choice for Georgia was to join NATO, join European Union, and become closer to the West. Armenia's, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but the dominant idea still in the statecraft is that on the one hand, the idea of keeping the results of the Karabakh war and not to lose what they won by power of arms. And the second fear of Turkey, which is also very important and dominant in the foreign and security policy of Armenia. Therefore, as Richard said, they were left with the very little choice but to become Russia's military ally. For Azerbaijan, one of the most and the dominant statecraft idea is actually to be less dependent on Russia to transport their energy to the other market. So this is the dominant idea of the statecraft. Therefore, that also determines the choice that they are not Russia's ally. They are not joining West because I mean, it comes with you know, obligations of liberalization and so on and so on. Therefore, it's non-allied country, as it was really very frequently referred to during the Cold War. But the interesting fact about the South Caucasus and their foreign policy choices, and which contradicts the Russia's logic that NATO represents a threat. So they, both Armenia and Azerbaijan, see Georgia's possible NATO membership as an opportunity for them too. And I think that my Armenian and Azeri colleagues would agree that Georgia's NATO integration would open the new opportunities for both countries as well as for the region as whole. And I think that it's really important component of the regional politics. And moving to my another point, which was spoken this morning, March of Freedom. People remember March of Freedom of 90s in Europe, and everyone agrees that it was beneficial not only for the new democracies. Of course, it was beneficial. They've been liberated, their economy grew, and then their democratic institutions have become stronger, and now they live much better life than they used to during the Cold War period. And Europe is safer, and of course it was also beneficial for all NATO members too. But we are frequently forgetting that it was supplemented, this March of Freedom was supplemented by incentives that was given to these Eastern and Central European countries after the liberation by the West. These incentives were not only the economic assistance, but also the opportunity to join Western institutions. And opportunity not only as a declaration, but as a process of democratization. That reminds me that of the decisions of Bucharest Summit of 2008, where the conceptual decision about Ukraine and Georgia becoming NATO member was taken, but Georgia was denied of the institutionalized tool of becoming the member, which could have been used also as an institutional tool to engage Western democracies into the process of reforms internally. That also affected Georgia's internal statecraft, as well as strengths of the Georgian democratic institutions and pace of reforms. So therefore, I mean, it could have been said that that time, that 2008 Bucharest Summit marks the beginning of not the era of strategic patience, but era of strategic uncertainty. And this strategic uncertainty is very visible in this region. If you want to use one word to describe future of South Caucasus, uncertain is the right word for it. There is absence of incentives to democratize. Of course, I mean, there are the huge mistakes or the absence of the policies on the certain directions of Georgian government, but there is also the dominant idea which Helen mentioned, that if you are not irritating Russia, it's then you may get in less trouble, which is partially product of Russian propaganda. And the biggest power, we spoke a lot about the Russian propaganda, Russian weaponization of information. The biggest power of the Russian propaganda, weaponization of the information, it's not even RT, which is immoral, and or those idiots that are saying that West is all about gays and taking out of our traditions. It's not about even what Lenin referred as useful idiots. People like, for example, Snowden, who is seeking justice and hiding in the most unjust country in the world. But it's about the absence of incentives for democratization in this particular region. There is no clear institutional or the political mechanisms how you are supporting or incentivizing the democratic reforms, especially in Georgia. So these were a few points I wanted to mention, and now I am ready to move to the question and answers.
So here's how I'd like to proceed. I want to just offer 2 or 3 quick reactions, but rather than go back to you now, everyone who's here has been patiently and loyally, devotedly here for a very long day. So I'd like to get to your questions and comments almost right away. So, and then we'll conclude by giving each of you a chance to respond to whatever you want. So if you want to respond to any of this, please make a note or two and then do so as the questions arise. First, I want to say about long-term versus short-term. I think this is actually, and now I'm going to give a purely American perspective. I think this is a very deep and insightful point, and it's one that can be made more broadly about American foreign policy. That it's a natural tendency to want to just meet the short-term challenges and imperatives, and it's not only, because there's a natural tendency, I think, in human psychology to discount the future and respond to the present or the near term, but it is also that, and David, chime in if you want to from your experience in the State Department, when someone is representing the United States in a country or is in a country or regional desk and they're a career foreign service officer, even if they're a political appointee, their career incentives are not to seed the soil for the next 10 or 20 years. Their career incentives are not to, excuse my language, screw up in the next 2 or 3 years. And maybe we need to do something, or at least we need strong presidential and secretarial leadership to change the career incentives. Because otherwise there is just, there's a natural evolution toward just not making waves. I will say as well, as someone who strongly, obviously favors a more values-oriented and democracy-oriented foreign policy, on the one hand, I think that the trade-off is often overestimated. On the other hand, we do need to acknowledge, at least in the short term, sometimes there are trade-offs if we lean harder on the Azerbaijani regime, which I favor doing, David. It's a gamble. We could force them to improve their human rights conditions, or maybe we could drive them more into the arms of Putin. Who knows? But it's just a personal reflection. I am constantly shocked at how much we underappreciate and undervalue our potential leverage. And I think it's a continuing shortcoming of imagination and analysis, first of all, before we even get to the action element of American foreign policy. And the third point I'll just make, and then any of you have questions, they're going to come in 45 seconds, it's kind of hit the head and say, my God, why can't we even embrace the obvious instances when the values-oriented approach is also the pragmatic approach? And when we have a country like Georgia or like Ukraine, and I would add Tunisia to the list now if you want to expand more broadly to the only Arab democracy, that is already a democracy and trying to make it work. And then we fail to embrace them and support them and kind of lock them in. And I think your language, Vasil, is completely appropriate in terms of hard incentives to commit to a democratic path. That, it seems to me, is neither pragmatic nor values-oriented. It's just total failure of imagination. So you'll have a chance to respond shortly, but anyone want to ask a question or make a comment now? And if no one does, you're going to respond more quickly. It could be people are voting with their hands by keeping them down to express how long a day it's been.
Or they all agree with us.
That may be. So anyone? Otherwise, we're going to wrap up by giving our colleagues a chance to respond to one another. David?
Just picking up on what you were saying, Larry, I would just say that too often in policy terms, we are presented with what I would argue is a false choice. Mm-hmm. We either promote our values or we promote our interests. Actually, promoting our values, universal values, is in our interest. And I think we need to do a better job of explaining that seeing democracy expand in other countries, seeing respect for human rights, works very much in American interest, Western interest, certainly in Georgia's interest, Armenia's interest, Azerbaijan's interest. Your comment about incentives for people who work in the bureaucracy, I think, is right. I would argue that the risk of being overly simplistic, there are two schools in the U.S. Foreign Service. There's the school that manages relations, that looks to get along. And then there's the school that promotes interests and values. That second school is a much smaller school than the first school, for the reasons you said, which is most desk officers, most people in embassies, as great as they are, tend to want to just move things along and get by and try to avoid something blowing up. But sometimes you actually need a bit of a confrontation that you hope will then lead to a better outcome in order to shake things up a little bit. So just to offer that, thanks.
Okay, anyone else before we close? So let's go down the row again, and Mustafa, if we can start with you.
Nothing to react actually, but let me finish with the three what people should do things for the region. In the first side, I was kind of cynical and I think pessimistic. So let me finish with a good side of it. First of all, I believe the regional actors must renounce the use of force in their political relations. Everybody would agree with this and think that, okay, why are we talking about this in the Caucasus terms? But none of the Caucasian countries, I mean the three countries of Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia, have done so yet. They have not renounced the use of force in their political relations and respect each other's territorial integrity. If you don't do that, then you leave the door open for others, like the Russians, to come and do the same thing. So this is, I think, very important, and all three countries have to do it very clearly, openly. The second, the interested outsiders, like Turkey, like European Union, like any other country, they must support the efforts to enhance good governance, creation of interdependencies, and regionalization of the Caucasus, economy and politics. Because so far in the Caucasus, the emphasis has been on the state building and sometimes nation building. Both of them could be harmful in the short term to development of democracy and peaceful relationships. So regionalization, creation of a regional identity of the Caucasus might be important, both in political terms and economic terms. And finally, international community. When I say international community, I mean the West, the European Union, NATO, and the United States, must encourage cooperative efforts and confidence-building measures, as well as actions in favor of peaceful resolution of disputes. As far as I'm concerned, the NATO and the European Union have not played their hand openly yet and have not supported enough democratization and value-based foreign policy in this region so far. And part of the blame should go towards them. And if they played their hand more openly and more enthusiastically to support the regional countries in their choices, we might have had a different geopolitical outlook today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Helen, you're next.
Well, very shortly, since there is nothing to react to, I will just react to what I said before, which is, though I pointed out what is the challenge, and the challenge is the lack of vision in the region, or even more, not understanding what are the pragmatic reasons for engaging and embracing in the region. But I have a very eventually optimistic view for two reasons. First is that there is an increasing understanding of Russian threat in the international community. if, of course, I would prefer to have this understanding in 2008 and not to pay the price of Ukraine, or even maybe even earlier in the early 90s. But it's clear that there is positive dynamics of understanding and perceiving the threat that Russia represents, a threat, and it leads a power game. And secondly, and that's my final point, Russia has, though it's very aggressive, it challenges all of us. It has neither ideological nor financial or any kind of resources to sustain another Soviet Union. So eventually, the value and strengths of the EU and NATO is much stronger than Russia. So this is, even if it's succeeding in its short-term goals, in a long term, Russia cannot sustain another Soviet Union.
Richard?
Now, I closed my presentation with a note of optimism from Armenia, but I do want to point to my optimism for Georgia. Georgia has regained its role as the center of gravity in the region, as the leader of reform and development. But what comes next is the test. It's the implementation, not the signing of the association agreement, that counts. More importantly, if we look at what comes next, the real energy that's important is not oil, it's not gas, it's human energy, human capital. And looking around this room, I see a new generation of leadership emerging in Georgia. And I'm sorry, it's not a Russian-speaking Soviet-trained, nor is it the general category of middle-aged men that we have in the region. Look around the room. My staff in Armenia, the best and brightest of my students, are predominantly female. No, but my point is, they've stayed all day. This is the generation that is to come.
But they're working for you, they have to stay.
No, the Georgians I'm talking about. In other words, what we see, the stamina, the determination, but what's needed is not to give in too easily to the real enemy. The enemy is not Russia. The real enemy is apathy. The key is engagement, civic engagement from the lowest level to the top. And we need to do a better job at demanding accountability for those in official positions of power and influence. And in terms of public service, we need officials designed to serve the national interest, not the self-interest. But I'm optimistic for the young people in the room. Actually, this is your country, it's your future. Decisions taken today will affect generations to come. So now is the time to get engaged.
Thank you.
That is a message that resonates with this room and this conference. Thank you so much. Vasil?
Thank you. You mentioned that natural impulse of bureaucracy not to screw up. And in previous life, I was a physician. I was trained as physician, so therefore I took Hippocrates Oath. And everybody, when it comes to the Hippocrates Oath, everybody keeps quoting only the first sentence, do no harm. But only do no harm is not being a physician. There is an entire page of other things. And I think that there is much more beyond do no harm. Therefore, I mean, that's what my point is, that it's important to have country-specific policies. Very frequently, especially in old NATO countries, we can see that the strategies with regard to this region are crafted through the prism of policy, of Russia policy, Russia strategy. And this is really the less effective thing one can do. Unless there is the country-specific strategies, how to incentivize, how to support democratic development, strengthening of the democratic institutions, and only to have this one overall general template, which has the Russia strategy on its cornerstone would not be effective. Of course, I mean, the last thing I want to do is to criticize only the Western strategies with regard to the region. I think that we are much more guilty of the situation we are in now, and I think that the biggest problem here is the absence of strategy, our own statecraft strategy, for time being. And mostly this is the one part of it, and then the second part is that sometimes we believe in a myth we have created for the electoral reasons ourselves, which is really widely spread disease in not only the emerging democracies, but also the democracies which are much more mature than Georgia. And one of these is that do not irritate Russia with your statecraft achievements. Russia will get irritated with every Georgia's statecraft objective. Therefore, we have to have very concise, clear strategy how to implement those reforms which are necessary not only not primarily for becoming NATO or EU member, but to have the state which is really effective, efficient, democratic, and based on the values we all cherish. Thank you.
Thank you so much. These have been very eloquent interventions. Let me just close with one last reflection. Again, a personal one and a distinctly American one. I'm not a diplomat, so I can be very candid. I think that do no harm has been a really guiding light of President Obama's foreign policy in his own personal mind. His natural instinct has been one of very, very great restraint, obviously, to put it politely. And in part, this is, I think, who he is. It's his kind of philosophy and instinct. In part, and the fact that he was elected twice with this kind of approach reflects a kind of exhaustion with the previous what was perceived to be the previous administration's overreach. No one asked me the question that I'm often asked, you know, why was 2005 an inflection point in terms of the democratic recession? I think there were a number of things that converged, including the fact that democracy had just spread very far. We were kind of globally probably primed for a correction because it had spread to a lot of places that didn't have strong supporting conditions. But you know, by 2005 or so, Iraq was really unraveling. And in particular, the American military intervention there did kind of begin in many minds in Europe and other parts of the world, in the Middle East, and with many Americans to associate, I think, unfortunately, democracy promotion with the use of force. You always see swings in American foreign policy toward interventionism and a confident projection of our values, and then toward a pulling back. I think we're seeing now, because many Americans, I think, increasingly are really alarmed by what's happening in the region and with Putin's really savage and aggressive actions in Ukraine, and by the expansion of both Sunni Islamist terrorism in the form of ISIS, and you know, people are waking up and realizing that Iran is about to essentially take over its fourth Sunni Muslim Arab country, which has just triggered the Saudi invasion of Yemen. I think there's a growing reaction against this in the United States. I think it needs to be said, one of the two of you, Mustafa or Helen, made the point that our failure to intervene in Georgia in 2008 gave Putin the confidence that he could do it again in Ukraine. I'm not sure. I think the more decisive moment was when Barack Obama drew a line in the sand in Syria and said, if chemical weapons are used, we will respond. And then chemical weapons were used, and we did not respond. The president got cold feet and said, well, I need to go to Congress, and it may not work out, and international law, and so on and so forth. And I was told by someone, I think, who has deep knowledge of what is happening in the Kremlin, that at that moment, Vladimir Putin drew the conclusion that Barack Obama would not stand up to him. Democracy always comes back to the people, and foreign policy has to be accountable ultimately to them as well. And the people cannot be foreign policy experts, but I see a change slowly gathering in American public opinion, and I think we'll see it play out in the next presidential election campaign, where a lot of Americans are increasingly concerned that we've now swung too far back in the other direction, and we need to be more assertive in projecting and defending our values, particularly when there are countries that are trying to make these universal values their own and institutionalize them, and that we can't just let another aggressive autocrat maraud around European soil, swallowing up more territory without an effective response. So thank you all, first of all, to our panelists one last time, but to all of you who've stood with us throughout the day. And Nino, do you have any words for us before we conclude?
No, thanks.
Okay, so hopefully we'll see you here tomorrow, and thank you again.